Welcome to module number 6 on gender and macroeconomics. It's a module that is going to be looking at macroeconomics issues and looking at how gender interfaces with those. I'll be covering quite a number of concepts, so I'll be going a little bit fast, but the idea is to give you a snapshot of what needs to be covered under this module and what you need to know, as well as help you to look at the other work and the narrative of the module that is already posted as part of this course. So let's jump right in. Gender and macroeconomics is one of those courses that some people come to with a bit of anxiety, but I would like to say that we shall try and keep it simple and not go into the deep detail and complications, but to look at the foundations and how the interconnections come through. Now, this module will enable participants to establish a foundation of gender-aware macroeconomics. And as you know, macroeconomics is typically seen to be gender blind. It examines the economic environment in general, but it rarely, if ever, is gender neutral. And the gender analysis of macroeconomics does underscore both how gender relations permeate macroeconomics concepts and how macroeconomic indicators only measure a portion of total economic activity, with important consequences for things like unpaid care work, household well-being, and the accurate evaluation of macroeconomic policies. Now, this model will also help participants to undertake a gender-aware investigation of macroeconomics. The module introduces and elaborates some of the key aspects of macroeconomics, including things like social accounting frameworks, the circular flow of income and product, domestic absorption, the multiplier, the accelerator, the two-gap analysis, and several of those fundamental concepts that are used in macroeconomics. And the module will also combine some of the materials that we had in earlier courses into one course. And overall, the module will really introduce a gender approach to contemporary macroeconomic development policy. So what is expected in terms of what should be coming out of this is that participants are introduced to gender-aware interrogation of macroeconomics, and participants broadly and simply understand the key aspects of macroeconomics, and also develop a gender-aware approach to macroeconomics. Now, some of the basic concepts that I would like to start with. Macroeconomics basically is really known as a study of the economy as a whole. It focuses on the combined activities of households, of firms, and government, and the total cumulative individual decisions which determines the economy's total spending, income, and production of goods and services. And macroeconomics theory and analysis is really divided into two very broad spheres. One of the spheres is what we call the productive real economy, and the other one is the financial or money economy. So the productive economy is what we sometimes refer to as the real economy, and the financial economy is sometimes also referred to as the money economy. And macroeconomic policies influence how these two spheres interact. And the productive economy combines labor, capital, and other productive factors like land, energy, natural resources, and technology to produce the economic output for exchange that comprises what we know as the gross domestic product. Now, the productive economy is also called the real sector because the factors of production as well as the output produced within it are physical, are real, in simple terms. The public sector operates as part of the real economy, and it is financed by fiscal policy, that is a government policy related to how government spends and also how government taxes or how government collects money. And the financial economy consists of the economic activities that involve the issue and exchange of financial assets. And financial assets here, we are talking about things like stocks, like bonds, and such other financial assets. Government affects the economy, the financial economy, through monetary policy and policy regarding the supply of money and the interest rate, which affect the demand for money and other financial assets, as well as the overall performance of the financial economy. Now, the relation between the real economy and the financial economy, as well as the role of the government in affecting that relation, is what is a matter of some of the debate in macroeconomic theory. But linkages do exist. For example, the setting of interest rates within the monetary economy has implications for the production of output and employment in the real economy. So that's just one example about how the two interface. Now, let me talk about one other important concept of macroeconomics, and that is social accounting frameworks. Adding up all the transactions of all households and firms as well as government is usually very difficult. So it's necessary to sort these activities into analytical categories which are useful and record the patterns of activities done by various economic units, so that you have those by household, those by farms, and those by government. And that's what is known as social accounting or social accounting frameworks. And in so doing, they detail the flows of goods and services between economic units and often hold agents or actors engaged in buying and selling of products, including inputs necessary for farms wanting to transform resources into marketable goods and services that can be brought about and sold. And social accounting can assist in understanding the key relations, if any, among the transactions taking place between the economic units in the economy as a whole. Here is another concept that is important to understand, which is the circular flow of income. I don't have enough time to explain this, but very, very briefly, this is the simplest representation of this circular flow of income. It can be represented differently, and some of the different representations are there in the narrative to this module. But largely, here you have two broad categories, households and farms. And what it shows here is that if you look at this blue line, labor goes from the household to farms, and then from the farms to households, you have goods going there. So really what you have is that from the households do spend, and the resources they spend or the money they spend goes to farms. And on the other hand, the farms give income to the households that then makes up what the household then spend on. And when they spend, they get goods, and then they give labor as an input into the farms. So in a very simple way, it just shows you that the farms and the households in a circular flow with these two major elements moving, labor moving that side, and goods also moving the other side. But this can be expanded if we put in other markets and also other levels to create a much more complex and realistic picture of what we know as circular flow. Now, quite simply, what happens is the households provide inputs, primarily labor, to the farms for wages. Farms use the labor to produce goods and services, which can be sold to households for cash, and households thus get money from the sale of labor to pay for the goods and services that the farms produce. So that's one of the ways and the simplest ways, as I've said. And so what you see here is really two sets of flows. There is a flow of income where payments for labor are turned into payments for goods. And then there is a flow of production into where the flow of labor resources from the household is turned into goods and services that then the households consume. There is also another concept that is important, and I'm really going fast over some of these concepts, is the concept of demand-side policies. Within the macroeconomic policies, there is what we know as the demand-side policies. And what demand-side policies do is they alter the pattern of spending within an economy. And this can take one of two forms. It can be an attempt to increase the rate of domestic absorption by increasing public or private spending, and thus the public or the private demand more. But these are what we call as expenditure increasing policies. Therefore, they raise the aggregate demand, and as will be seen in economic growth. Now, to reduce the rate of domestic absorption, governments sometimes cut public or private spending, and hence public or private demand. Now, these policies are what is called expenditure reducing policies. Cutting consumption and investment cuts aggregate demand. However, in so doing, it also affects economic growth. So just keep that as a major concept that we shall return to when we talk about gender, which is demand-side policies. But we also have something called fiscal and monetary policy. Now, fiscal policy is policy of government toward its taxation and spending plans. Now, monetary policy is government policy towards supply of money, and hence interest rates are the effective price of money. The government can use fiscal policies and monetary policies to alter the rate of growth in one or two ways. To increase the rate of growth of demand, what the government can do is that's when a government spending increases. There is an increase in government demand for goods and services from the private sector. So when government spends more money, then demand for goods and services for government and back from the private sector can also go up. When government taxes fall, then there is an increase in household and farm demand as they are paying less to government, and thus they could be theoretically having more disposable income to spend because they are spending less taxes. So that's the theory behind that. Now, when interest rates fall, the level of investment by farms increases as it becomes less expensive to borrow from the financial economy, and the holding of money by households and farms in the financial economy becomes less attractive. But those are what we were calling the supply, the demand side policies, those that alter demand. Supply side policies, there are those policies that alter the pattern of production of goods and services within an economy to increase the domestic production of goods and services and to reduce the demand for foreign goods and services. And that's what they do ultimately is to configure the composition of domestic absorption away from externally produced goods and services towards domestically produced goods and services. And for this reason, supply side policies are also called expenditure switching policies because of the way in which they alter where the goods and services that are consumed come from. There's another important concept, which is the market deregulation. And these are other policies also that are used in macroeconomics. And what we know about market deregulation, in very simple terms, supply side policies involve dismantling a range of interventions that affect the operation of markets to increase either the efficiency of resource utilization within an economy or the productive capacity within an economy, both of which promote an expansion of production and economic growth. Now, price controls, taxes, subsidies, trade restrictions, and other operations of monopolistic state-owned enterprises that bypass the market and so reduce the efficiency of markets in allocating resources in the real economy really come from a part of these kinds of policies. And supply side policies also remove some of the distortions and thus they deregulate the market to permit market-determined prices, to reflect market-determined costs, and better allocating the resources of households and farms, and enhancing the supply capacities of the economy without cutting the consumption. Now, if we are to move on, let's say something about the role of unpaid care work in macroeconomic flows, because from the concepts that we have seen, you will realize that there are a couple of things we can say about this. If you go back to the first three modules that we've been able to cover, I think you realize that those modules did demonstrate that households where unpaid care work and other unpaid labor takes place, productive activities that are excluded from the macroeconomic models that are discussed above. Many of those happen at the household level. And we used several examples when we are talking about unpaid care work, for example. And you know that households do not just spend their income on what is produced, but because, as you know, without unpaid care work, many consumption goods, like things like food, could not be consumed. And the production and sale of goods and services by farms could not take place because such production really relies on the households using unpaid care work to produce what we call labor capable of working. If you think even about a person, the kind of things that have to happen to you at home, the sleeping, the eating, ironing your clothes, the bathing, all those other things, all the care that is given to a person is really fundamentally what then affects what ends up as what the household contributes to the economy. Therefore, macroeconomics needs to include labor as a produced factor of production taking place in the household and requiring unpaid care work and the allocation of real resources for investment in the capabilities of labor, otherwise known as human capital. Because by the time you get that human capital, there is actually a lot that goes on in terms of the production of that labor. And that happens at household level through the services that are offered in unpaid care work. So unpaid care work also takes place outside the household, in the community, in the form of voluntary services which contributes to the maintenance of rules, of norms, and of values of civic responsibility and community, otherwise known as social capital. So yes, we are not just economic agents, but we are also people, and we reproduce ourselves differently, even in terms of values of how we do things and what rules we govern us. All that is part of what we are talking about, which is contributed to macro by unpaid care, but also influences macroeconomics. Let me turn now to fiscal policy and say something about where it comes from. Now, fiscal policy is another part of macroeconomics, and this refers to how government spending, taxation and aid and debt, what is known as the government budget, influence the economy as a whole. And fiscal policy usually is oriented towards combating things like inflation and reducing current account deficits. Now, public spending on especially social sectors was cut out in countries after country in order to achieve fiscal balance. And this was one of the major interventions that were being supported by the structural adjustment policies, for example, because the state was seen as crowding out what they called at the time efficient private sector employment in the public sector. That meant that there was a reduction in the public sector and a privatization of public services as a key policy objective. In fact, in some of the countries, we even started seeing the use of user fees. User fees were adopted in health and in other services, sometimes on water, in order to increase efficiency of public service delivery. But we realize that it cannot be assumed that government spending patterns that try to achieve fiscal balance have the same effects on women and men. For example, when you think about cutbacks to public services, they do actually place a lot of pressure on unpaid care. Because when, for example, you have user fees in a health center, you may find that those who fall sick will depend very much on the care they get in the household to cure them rather than going to clinics or hospitals. And that in itself means that you have an undue burden. Public service employment and cash for work programs do provide a source of formal employment for women sometimes, and these are some of the policies that were being put there to try and create what they were calling ways of coping with the social impacts of structural adjustment. But we also know that even with that, you sometimes may have a bigger burden for women, especially if they still have to do all the unpaid care work and still go out and be part of the formal employment. Now, finally, infrastructure spending can also have both beneficial and differential impacts on women and men, depending on the type of public investment. If it is water or roads or those kinds of things, they all don't affect men and women in the same way. The general fiscal policy issues, usually there are two major areas that are of particular concern that we may touch on here. One is government spending and crowding. Now, fiscal austerity is one of the ingredients that were very clearly part of the structural adjustment poverty reduction times. And this was about cutting back on government spending so that it is in line with tax revenues of the country and also with the increasing of taxes. Now, fiscal austerity ensures that government spending is kept low so that it does not crowd out what the private sector investments and government consumption drives interest rate up, which sometimes discourages the private sector from borrowing. Now, from a gender perspective, stopping government spending to stimulate private sector investment may not always be good, because government spending that invests in human capital, for example, while it improves private sector productivity through things like good health, good education, and many other things of that nature. So it's not always that government spending, while can sometimes crowd in the private sector, if it supports private sector productivity and expands domestic demand and supply. Now, there are also other general fiscal policies like taxation, which we could have discussed in a bit of detail, but taxation, we have indirect taxes, which are the biggest source of tax revenue. They include trade taxes, value-added taxes, sales and excise taxes, which are the broad categories that we have. And trade liberalization is known to have brought a decline in revenues from trade taxes, hence the increase in indirect taxes to make up for the lost revenue that comes because of cuts in government spending. And indirect taxes like VAT sometimes may be themselves regressive, because the poor sometimes pay much higher share of VAT than the rich, because for women's gender prescribed place in the labor market, it can affect women more. It depends on, if you think about an 18% tax on a quarter kilo of sugar versus that same tax on, say, a bag of rice, it can affect those who pay, who buy much less at a much higher rate. But policies that reduce the regressive nature of indirect taxes sometimes are sometimes good for gender equality, like zero tax on food, on agricultural implements, children's goods. Some of these may be good for gender equality. And I know that some countries have always been running such policies to try and make sure that they impact gender issues much more. Some countries don't have taxes on agricultural inputs, on children's goods or educational materials, food, and that is very, very helpful in terms of the impact that it will have on women and men. Let's quickly talk about aid policy. Now, aid policy is an important revenue side of government budget. In many countries, for example, in Rwanda, aid has contributed to nearly half of the budget over the years, and in other countries, that same has happened. Now, when you look at issues of gender and aid delivery, aid should finance national development strategy that has clear gender objectives. That would be what we should be having as our aspiration. The extent to which gender equality and women's empowerment objectives are part of the longer-term vision that underpins national development strategy is something that is important within the context of aid. And prioritization there, with linkages between the objectives and targets of the policy and the gender equality and women's empowerment is very, very important. But also to create a strategic linkage to the budget would also be significant. It would also be very, very important, because resources should be allocated to achieve the gender equality and women's empowerment objectives, but also to identify the sector programs. And also gender equality perspectives should be integrated in financial processes. Now, sex disaggregated data should also be used for gender results, just to re-echo what we said in the gender and data and indices module. it is important that data is collected and it is disaggregated and is disseminated, and that donors, if they are there, can be very supportive in building national capacities for this, because this is one of the ways in which issues of gender can then be able to influence aid policies. Let me say something about debt sustainability, both external and domestic. And in the absence of increased official development assistance, government spending can only increase faster than the growth rate of tax revenues if governments borrow to make up the difference. Now, sustained deficit financing to the government budget sometimes leads to a much higher debt burden. And debt servicing, which is about repaying of debts, is usually with interest, is what then becomes the issue. Now, what is monetary policy? This is another part I would like to say something about very quickly, because it's part of the macroeconomic discussions that we're having. Macroeconomic policy is really the instruments that include money supply, the supply of credit and interest through interventions into aid and financial markets. And monetary policy is conducted by central governments, which often are independent strategic bodies. And central banks conduct monetary policy by targeting the growth rate of the money supply to reach an inflation target that is usually set. Many countries want their inflation to be a single-digit inflation. Now, tighter control of money supply also reduces the ability of households and firms to express the demand in the economy. And sometimes this leads to cuts in consumption and investments, and thus the rate of domestic absorption, which theoretically should be helpful to inflation. When we think about gender and monetary policy, I think the key point there is that monetary policy interacts in a gendered structure and in gendered institutions. There is impact on the restrictive if you think about it, the impact of restrictive monetary policies will be felt differently for households, including unpaid care of labor. That could be something there, but also for labor markets, paid employment is also affected by monetary policy, and also credit and finance is affected by monetary policy. So if if the impact on gender is ignored or devalued, undervalued, monetary policy may look beneficial than it actually is. And that in itself can be a problem. We could have gone a bit deeper in this, but maybe just to summarize very quickly, that there are three major gender biases that usually come out of monetary policy. In employment is that the restrictive monetary policy affects women's employment more than it affects men, because when you have a real exchange rate appreciation, this can affect export sectors where women's employment in certain sectors, in informal activities, especially non-agricultural self-employment, often is an important source of employment and income for women. And much of this is linked to services in the domestic market. So again, here, restrictive monetary policies may limit the development of such markets. At household level, policies that squeeze household financial resources will certainly increase the demand on women's unpaid care work. Let me say something about inflation and its implications on gender. Very quickly, I think a universal goal for monetary policy is to control inflation. But what causes inflation? A very common cause is price shocks, in which prices would rapidly increase, particularly in terms of food and fuel. This is supply-side inflation that it originates in the real economy, or it could be excessive growth of money supply that happened some years back, for example, in Zimbabwe, And to control inflation, usually there is specific policies that are suggested. Effectiveness of monetary policy controlling inflation at socially acceptable levels depends on where it's coming from. Either if it is supply driven or demand side inflation, where it's coming from, therefore matters. And if monetary policy compresses domestic demand, that in itself can create an issue of higher rates of inflation or low inflation. And the effects of this could be increased pressure to rely on unpaid care work, cutting back on consumption that may affect women and men differently, or increased participation of women in paid employment that may offset the cutbacks in income, but also it doesn't decrease but increase with unpaid care work, and therefore sometimes it can even perpetuate what we call time poverty. Let me say something about exchange rates and exchange regimes. There are several exchange rates that we have that usually countries use. There is what we call floating exchange rates, or fixed exchange rates, or managed exchange rates. And these are the generic types of exchange rates that are available in many countries. Now, in terms of these exchange rates, to say something more about them, I want to say a lot more about them, but these are things that you can read and find out and see, because in different places they are used differently. We also have something which I wanted to talk a little bit about, which is fiscal policy evolution. Fiscal policy refers to how government spending happens, especially in the budget, and is usually reoriented towards combating inflation, and public spending on social sectors is usually cut in some countries in order to achieve fiscal balances. As we said before, in some countries, you even have the use of different types of strategies that try to deal with the issue of fiscal policy. Now, let me stop this here and say that within the discussions on macroeconomics, they are quite several significant interventions that we can make, but you could see from the broad brush that I have just painted that while we talk about macroeconomics as being very, very much broad, and some people think it's gender neutral, when you go a little bit deeper and look at the impacts that are faced by women and men, especially at household level, by these different macroeconomic interventions, you start seeing certain impacts. And that is what we want to say here broadly, that in macroeconomic analysis, we cannot make the assumption that there will be no impact on women and men, because there will always be an impact on women and men, depending on the type of policy that you have in place and how that policy is being implemented by a government. So once again, I want to thank you very much for listening to me. I hope this broad brush was helpful. I'll keep it here, and as I always emphasize, please do look at the other narratives that are posted in the module, are posted online, so that you can get a little bit more out of the module. With that, I want to thank you, and I'll see you in the next course.